Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class as we move through the biblical narrative. The next series of lectures, beginning with this one, will focus on Israel's life in the land, talking about the materials found in Joshua through 2 Kings. This is the introductory lecture to the next block. And in this one, we're going to go over some of the key themes that we're going to see and how to understand the overarching move of Joshua through 2 Kings. There is a previous video where I talk about what's known as the Deuteronomistic history that argues for essentially the unity of Joshua through 2 Kings, and even suggests that perhaps they're the work in the final form of at least one author or one specific theological perspective that goes back to the book of Deuteronomy itself. So I want to begin with a review, very brief review of the theological themes that show up in the book of Deuteronomy, because we're going to need to remember these to be able to make sense of some of the things that we're going to see in Joshua through 2 Kings. The first one is Deuteronomy's insistence, and again, this sounds like a no-brainer from a Christian view in 2023, but it was the insistence that there's literally one God, or that Israel has one God alone and has total allegiance to one God, and that God, of course, is the Lord. That's epitomized in the Shema in Deuteronomy 6, where it's, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone," or Yahweh is our one and only. Deuteronomy also argues vehemently that there is going to be one place for the proper worship of Yahweh, one altar. Deuteronomy doesn't tell us where that place will be. It's going to be the place that the Lord chooses. Once we move into Joshua through 2 Kings, eventually that one place is going to become the temple in Jerusalem. There's one standard, and that standard is the Mosaic Torah. Again, so Deuteronomy assumes that truth, the way of life, is revealed through the revelation that Moses received from the Lord at Sinai, as epitomized in most broadly in the Ten Commandments, and then is further distilled and contextualized in the various laws that shape and become what we know as the Torah. Again, for Deuteronomy itself, we would be talking about the materials from Deuteronomy chapter 5 roughly through chapter 26. There's a certainty of justice. Deuteronomy gives us the familiar rubric that demands, as a response to God's grace, faithfulness. And if Israel is faithful, there is the promise of life in the land. If Israel is unfaithful, the promise ultimately is exile. So those themes are going to be recurring, as we'll see, even as early as the book of Joshua, while they're in the process of even getting into the land. And then there's a demand for the totality of devotion. Deuteronomy has what I call a vocabulary of faithful obedience. So you have words like, obviously, like obey, but you also have words like love. Love the Lord your God. That's an interesting thing as a commandment, or to cling, walk in his ways, fear the Lord. You have essentially an underlying interest in motivation. You have that idea in Deuteronomy of having a circumcised heart. In other words, a heart, that's our will, surrendered to God. So that's one of the backdrops. We have to remember the theology of Deuteronomy as we work into these books. The second thing is we need to remember there's a backdrop to what's going on here, and there's a backdrop to the prophets. And I have the word prophets here just to remind us, if we were reading these scriptures in the context of the synagogue, that in the Jewish canon, You have the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And so the second set of books and the prophets start from Joshua and they run all the way through Malachi, right? And so these are known as the former prophets. So I have a little bit of this lingo here just to remind us of that these books are considered prophetic. And one of the reasons for that is there's lots of prophetic activity embedded in narratives. These books are narrative. The books that most Protestants, that probably most people that are taking this class or listen to this video have always thought of the prophets essentially as Isaiah to Malachi. But there's a broader understanding of prophets. And one of the things we have to remember is the backdrop to all this. It's the Sinai covenant. That's the covenant that Deuteronomy witnesses to, that retells. It's the God's people come out of Egypt and God cuts a covenant with them where they become God's people. It says, the whole earth is mine. You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So Israel is called into a covenant relationship. And notice then how the book of Joshua begins. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to act in accordance with all the law that my servant Moses commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or the left, so that you may be successful wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night. So that you may be careful to act in accordance with all that is written in it, for then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall be successful. So again, the key to Israel's future, beginning with Joshua, who follows right after Moses, is going to be a faithful response to the grace that God's given Israel by practicing faithfulness. So in a sense, Joshua's entire job description as leader was to be the first convert to the Torah and to model faithfulness. The second thing that, then that continues on just to show a link here. Notice how the Psalms are the first book of the writings, and notice we have a verse that is identical with Joshua 1:8. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. So just notice, once you get out of the Torah, that Joshua and Psalms begin with a reminder that all Scripture is essentially commentary on the Torah, right? And so God's covenant with Israel at Sinai is the basis for what happens next. So when we talk about the prophetic books, and this includes Joshua to 2 Kings, which is going to be the subject of the next couple of lectures, and then there'll be some materials on the prophets, so-called or better known prophets, Isaiah to Malachi, coming up. But basically what we have then are two types of materials. We have narrative, Joshua to 2 Kings. These are telling the stories about Israel and how God sends his servants, the prophets, in the midst of historical context. Some of the major prophets show up, like Isaiah has a prominent role to play in Joshua through 2 Kings, for example. Other well-known prophets in these narratives are going to be Elijah and Elisha, who don't have their own prophetic books, but clearly dominate the narrative of 1 Kings and 2 Kings. And then, of course, we have prophetic books that are mostly the messages of the prophets themselves, which is going to be Isaiah to Malachi, and those are known as the latter prophets. Okay, Israel and the land. The way that I understand all the historical books, and this is usually what Protestants call these, and that gets extended to Joshua through 2 Chronicles. Now, in this particular lecture, we're focusing on Joshua through 2 Kings, and we have a distinction that's usually made. It's between the primary history, which is basically Genesis all the way to 2 Kings, which tells the story from creation to exile. And then you have what's known as the chronicler's history, which are the books of First and Second Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah that sort of retell Israel's history and then include the return from exile, the rebuilding of the temple, and the rebuilding of Jerusalem. But we're not going to say much about the chroniclers, Ezra and Nehemiah, right now. But my understanding of the stories in Scripture and what they do is Israel's story of its time in the land provides a testimony to the prospects and the perils of serving as a missional community in the world. So these stories here aren't just history, they're teaching history about what it looks like to be God's people in the world. And so we're going to try to always go back to a missional understanding as we read these. Okay, so the Sinai covenant is one key backdrop. The second backdrop to these books is Israel's unfaithfulness. And unfaithfulness happens in essentially three ways, with two main ones. Okay, the principal act of unfaithfulness, and this is super important because this extends into the New Testament and arguably today. The greatest danger to Israel's faith was syncretism, also known as idolatry. That is the corruption of religious faith by mixing in elements of other religions in a way that essentially pulls the transcendent creator God, Yahweh, back into the mythical systems of the religions of Israel's neighbors. That's syncretism. It's mixing the true faith with something else. Like if you want examples of things where we see this today, you can see the corrupt influences of political ideologies of the right and the left and how they corrupt Christianity. Again, popular critiques of more conservative ideology affecting Christianity is what's called Christian nationalism. But let us not forget that there's an equally leftist version of that as well. It just doesn't quite get as much press. Both equally need to be critiqued because they're examples of syncretism. Super important to be on the lookout for that. And we'll say more about that issue, but that's one thing. But that was Israel's problem. And as you read the stories, it's not that Israel stops worshiping Yahweh. It's that Israel worships Yahweh and then also Baal and other things. So they sort of hedge their bets, if you will. And what that does is it just makes Yahweh one of the gods instead of the God. Huge difference there. That's syncretism. And then there's also the issue of injustice that in some ways flows out of syncretism, but it's particularly the abuse of the poor. So the injustice is a major backdrop in these books, and it's signs of Israel's unfaithfulness. So it's idolatry, injustice, and then there's a third one. I'd call this a minor one, but this is more of an arrogance that comes into play where Israel believed it was immune and that it had security apart from its own faithfulness. And so enough said there, but that shows up in the Old Testament as well. Okay. All right, so that gives us a little bit of an introduction to what we're going to see in the rest of Joshua through 2 Kings. If you have questions, please reach out and ask. In the next video, we're going to jump right into the book of Joshua itself.